Sovereign debt is the debt that governments hold, and it can be an important source of development finance, and countries can use it to make important public investments. Countries can borrow both domestically and internationally in foreign currencies from other countries or from institutions like the International Monetary Fund and multilateral development banks, as well as from international private investors. In the decade following the 2009 global recession, developing countries significantly increased their borrowing, mostly because of favorable monetary conditions like low interest rates in wealthy countries, as well as demand from private investors. Global economic shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic and the US Fed's increase of interest rates in 2022 have caused capital flight, exchange rate volatility, and have increased the unsustainable debt burdens in developing countries. Now, nearly 80 countries are in or at risk of debt distress, and the high payments that they make to creditors as a result of the high interest rates and their debt burdens really take a large portion out of their budgets, which means that they can't allocate their scarce resources towards public services like infrastructure, healthcare, and education, and they can't make the necessary investments into preparation and adaptation for climate change, for climate mitigation, as well as other sustainable development goals. External public debt is denominated in US dollars and other foreign currencies. It can be particularly difficult for developing countries when it reaches significant levels because it cuts into their international exchange reserves, which means that when they're making very high debt payments in foreign currencies, they have less exchange reserves to be able to pay for important imports like food and medicine. And it can also threaten balance of payments crises. External public debt is also a problem because countries aren't able to restructure it domestically, which leaves them with few options for resolution when they do approach crisis or are in crisis. Debt has become a cyclical burden for developing countries, especially in the context of the climate crisis. So nearly 80 developing countries are in or at risk of debt distress, and the majority of them, over 60, are highly climate vulnerable. Climate disasters are becoming increasingly frequent and expensive. Developing countries don't have the capacity to properly respond to climate disasters as they occur, for example, to hurricanes or droughts and crop failures, including long-term effects. And so they're often forced to take on higher debt burdens in order to finance the response to climate change. And in addition, the climate finance that's provided by wealthy countries is actually mostly in the form of loans, which means that it increases the debt burden in developing countries. Developing countries that are climate vulnerable and highly indebted also face poor borrowing terms on their debt, including higher interest rates due to their vulnerability. All of this significantly decreases their fiscal space and their ability to spend domestically on important items such as infrastructure, education, and healthcare, as well as long-term goals like climate preparedness and sustainable development. This in turn makes them more vulnerable to future disasters. This also makes them vulnerable to economic shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic and monetary tightening in wealthy countries. In this way, high debt burdens make countries more vulnerable to future climate disasters.
So in theory, these surcharges are supposed to disincentivize countries from relying too much on the IMF. But in reality, there's already plenty of disincentive to go to the IMF. Countries only go if they really have no other choice. So what they end up doing instead is taking countries that are facing severe economic challenges, adding additional debt to their debt burdens, making it harder to reduce those burdens to sustainable levels, and siphoning off much needed resources that could otherwise be spent on health, on education, on climate action, or on development. Now, this would be a problem at any time, but it's especially bad in the world that we're in that's rocked by multiple global crises, from the pandemic to the global debt crisis to the war in Ukraine and its resulting food and energy price shocks to the climate crisis. And these are all clearly massive global issues that are well beyond the reach of any one developing country. And so as a result of this, just a few years ago, there were 8 countries paying surcharges. These days, there are 22. So it's nearly tripled in just a few years. As you'll see on the map, it's increasingly affecting countries in Latin America and countries in Africa. So what does it look like to be one of these countries? What are some of these countries that are being forced to pay surcharges? To take a look at just 3 of the top 5 most heavily impacted countries. One is Pakistan. 2 years ago, 1/3 of Pakistan's entire territory was underwater as a result of devastating floods. There's a climate crisis-driven natural disaster, and Pakistan has very little responsibility for the climate crisis. And still, it's being punished for the debts that it takes on to sort of survive this moment. Another is Egypt. Prior to the war in Ukraine, Egypt relied on Russia and Ukraine for 85% of its wheat imports. So Egypt has really been rocked by these food price shocks. Hunger has increased. They recently had to cut their bread subsidies. And another country that's paying surcharges is Ukraine itself. Ukraine actually pays more in surcharges than nearly any other country in the world. And I don't think any of us here would really think that what Ukraine needs right now is to be punished for having accumulated debt with additional debt. In fact, what this effectively means is that as the US financially supports Ukraine, billions of those dollars are being siphoned off into the IMF's coffers. So this is not just a misguided policy and imposition on developing countries. I mean, it really affects the people in these countries and the ability of these countries to provide for their people. So much so, in fact, that a few years ago, 9 UN independent human rights experts sent a letter to the IMF expressing their grave concern that surcharges impede fundamental human rights. Or, in fact, as Nobel laureate economist Joe Stiglitz said about surcharges go exactly against what the IMF is supposed to be doing. It's supposed to be helping countries, not extracting extra rents from them because of their dire need.